Thank you for watching our video on martial arts. This video is more of a discussion on self-defense techniques. Hopefully it will answer some questions that you may have or point you in the right direction for future training. We're going to talk about the role of self-defense techniques in martial arts training. There are some people who would argue that memorized self-defense techniques have no real value, that under duress in a real-life situation, you won't perform a memorized technique anyway, and they're simply a waste of time. But do they have value? And if they do, what is the role of the self-defense techniques in the system? First, let's define what is a self-defense technique. By definition, a self-defense technique is a series of basic moves designed to defeat a specific attack. So, for example, if someone tried to punch you with the right hand, you'd perform a series of moves in a certain order in order to stop them from hitting you. That is what we would define as a technique. And in our school, most of the techniques are also named, so it makes it easier for you to memorize them and perform them for testing purposes. But anyone who's actually trained for a while and has been in serious situations would probably agree that you won't do a technique as memorized in class. There are too many variables. Nothing goes exactly the way you practiced it in class, or hardly ever, at any rate. So why should we even bother? Probably the best explanation I can give you is one that I read about in a book called The Way and the Power, written by Frederick Lovray. Lovray Sensei was a master swordsman. And in his book, he uses an analogy of a tree. The tree is representing the root, or the system. The roots provide the tree with the foundation of whatever that particular root is based upon. For example, some root might be based on entirely circular motions, disrupting the balance of the opponent. Other root might be more direct, striking techniques. However the ryu was designed, the founder had an idea that he pursued. That is the root of the tree. That is the foundation. The branches of the tree are the principles. You may have an idea of how something should be done, but it would be abstract. For example, if you were to say, you should always use your opponent's energy against him. That's an idea. But how do we do that? You have to have certain principles involved. One of those principles might be disrupting his balance. And that's an interesting principle, and I think most sophisticated martial arts instructors would agree that's an important one, regardless of the ryu or the style. But that's the principle. How do you put that principle into practice? Now, this doesn't apply just to martial arts. In business, for example, suppose you were to tell your employees that they need to use integrity, conduct themselves with integrity while working for your company. Now, you might assume that everyone knows what that means. But one person raises their hand and says, I'll do it. I just don't understand what integrity means. And so then you explain, well, that means to treat people right, to do the right thing. And he might look at you and say, but how do I know what is the right thing? So we have a root principle that flows up into the branches. by way of explanation. But to put that into practice, you need the leaves. In martial arts, the leaves are the techniques. The leaves support the branches. Without any leaves, your tree is going to be dead. Without any branches, you're left with taking leaves and trying to stick them to the trunk, which isn't going to work either. And that last example is quite often someone who decides to create techniques out of thin air with no real background in training. They don't understand the principles. They simply shuffle together some movements that they think might look good and try to make them stick. This never works. So the role of techniques in martial arts should be to demonstrate a principle, which is the branch, which is supported by the root of the system. Now, where we run into trouble is when students memorize the techniques, because that's the starting place. But there's no real understanding on why they are performing that technique. In the beginning, it's not as important because they're still growing. And in many cases, if you overload a new student with too much information, he simply can't absorb it all anyway. Or he may become intimidated by the flow of information and decide to quit. It's too much, can't handle it. So we start the students by memorizing the techniques. We, as instructors, know that the techniques will work. The student has to trust that his instructor is, in fact, experienced and trained and will guide them down the correct path. But at some point, the student should be asking, why am I doing this technique this way? And the instructor should be able to answer. Or better yet, help the student find the answer. So when you're memorizing your techniques, they will work in an ideal situation the way that you've memorized them. But if you're faced with a situation for which you did not train specifically, if you don't know why you're doing each technique, you won't be able to trace back down that branch and go out onto another leaf, another technique. You'll be stuck there. So I want to make sure that you understand this analogy. The techniques are important. They support the principles of what we do, much like the leaf supports the tree. If you strip all the leaves away, you're left with nothing but branches, and it will die. But if all you do is memorize techniques and there's no real understanding, essentially you're picking leaves and putting them in a basket and calling that a tree. And of course, it's going to have no value. It's going to wither, it's going to die, and leave you with nothing. So I would encourage you, as you begin working through your techniques, do memorize them. Do practice. Do perform them the way that they're supposed to be done. Every technique has a purpose. But also, begin to question, why am I doing this technique? There's a very old quote in martial arts that says, from 1 comes 2, and from 2 comes 10,000. So starting off, you might only memorize 1 or 2 techniques, but as you continue, you'll see how things can branch out from there and become more and become more. You'll never, ever be able to memorize in a lifetime a technique for every possible scenario, every possible situation. There's just not enough time. there are too many variables. So in your journey, start to ask, why am I doing this? What is the purpose? What is the underlying principle? What am I supposed to be learning here so that I can apply it in another situation? At that point, you will have a fully functioning tree, and it will serve you well. If you have any questions about this, or insights or thoughts, send me an email. I'd be glad to hear from you. Thanks for watching.